I came home 3 months early to surprise my family, but what I found shattered my entire world. My 7-year-old son was locked in a freezing storage unit, shivering with a 102-degree fever, while a plate of rock-hard rice sat next to him on the concrete floor. His actual bedroom had been completely gutted and turned into a lavish designer playroom for my sister's daughter. When my mother saw me standing there holding my burning sick child, she simply rolled her eyes and told me my sister needed the space. I did not scream or cry. I just pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and pressed one single button that would destroy their perfect lives. My name is Nicole, and I am 34 years old. I work as a healthcare management consultant, a career requiring me to travel across the country for months at a time, leading high-stakes hospital transitions. I have made immense personal sacrifices to provide a comfortable life for my family, but I had absolutely no idea they were using my hard-earned money to fund a lifestyle of extreme luxury while treating my own son like a stray animal. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fiercely protect your child from the people who are supposed to love them the most. Growing up in an affluent suburb in Connecticut, my parents, David and Susan, always projected the image of the perfect upper-middle-class family. They cared far more about country club memberships and luxury cars than actual human connection. My younger sister, Brittany, was always the golden child who could do no wrong in their eyes. She married Terrence, an African-American man who confidently branded himself as a tech startup chief executive officer. He loved flashing designer watches and expensive suits, but his company seemed to constantly burn through cash without ever turning a profit. When my consulting firm landed a massive national contract, I knew I would be away on the road for 6 grueling months. My parents generously offered to let my son Leo stay with them in the very house I grew up in. I agreed to the arrangement and wired them $4,000 every single month, specifically earmarked for Leo's daily care, nutritious food, medical needs, and extracurricular activities. Fast forward 3 months into my contract. I worked overtime, taking on extra shifts and weekend meetings so I could wrap up the first major phase of my project early. I was incredibly excited to surprise Leo. I took a red-eye flight straight from the airport to my parents' house in Connecticut without telling anyone I was coming. It was a freezing November morning, the kind of bitter cold that bites right through your heavy winter coat and chills you to the bone. I used my old spare key to unlock the front door, anticipating the look of pure joy on my little boy's face when he saw me standing in the hallway after being away for so long. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the central heating hit me like a wall. I could hear loud laughter and the clinking of wine glasses coming from the kitchen. I dropped my luggage by the stairs and quietly made my way down the hall toward the spacious guest bedroom Leo had been using since I left. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a massive smile on my face, but that smile vanished instantly. The room was completely unrecognizable. The superhero posters I had bought for Leo were gone. The sturdy oak bed we had picked out together was missing. Instead, the entire room had been painted a sickening shade of bubblegum pink. There was a massive custom-built princess castle bed taking up half the room, surrounded by towering piles of designer toys, expensive porcelain dolls, and a miniature motorized luxury car. It was a pristine shrine built exclusively for Brittany and Terrence's 5-year-old daughter Zoe. Panic seized my throat like a vice. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. Where was my son? I ran upstairs, checking the other guest rooms, but they were pristine and completely empty. I checked the basement playroom, but found absolutely nothing. The laughter from the kitchen continued echoing down the hall, oblivious to my mounting terror. I sprinted back down the corridor, my mind racing through 100 terrifying scenarios, until I noticed the door to the old storage room at the very back of the house. It was a poorly insulated add-on space that my parents strictly used to keep seasonal decorations and broken junk. The door was shut tight. I grabbed the brass handle and threw it open. A blast of frigid winter air hit me instantly. The room had no heating vents, and the drafty window was poorly sealed against the brutal outside cold. In the dark corner of the dusty room lay a thin, stained mattress tossed directly onto the bare concrete floor. Curled into a tight, trembling ball on that mattress was my 7-year-old son. He was wearing a thin summer t-shirt and lightweight sweatpants, shivering violently under a single scratchy blanket that offered zero warmth. Next to his head, resting directly on the dirty floor, was a cheap paper plate containing a lump of leftover white rice that had gone completely hard and cold. I dropped to my knees and scooped him into my arms. His skin was burning hot to the touch. He felt like a human furnace despite the freezing temperature of the storage room. I pressed my cheek against his forehead, and my panic morphed into pure terror. He was burning up with a severe fever that felt well over 102 degrees. Leo slowly opened his heavy eyes and looked at me, his breathing shallow and rattling with a wet, sickly sound that terrified me. He whispered my name, his voice barely a raspy croak as he clung to my shirt. I wrapped my coat tightly around his fragile, trembling body, promising him that Mommy was here and that everything was going to be all right now. The overwhelming surge of maternal protective instinct mixed with a dark, brewing rage. I stood up, carrying his burning body against my chest, and turned toward the hallway. It was time to find out exactly what was happening in this house. I walked down the hardwood hallway with Leo shivering against my chest. The temperature difference between the back of the house and the main living area was staggering. Down here, the central heating was cranked up so high it felt like a tropical resort. I rounded the corner and stepped into the sunken living room. My mother Susan and my father David were lounging on the oversized leather sectional, sipping from crystal glasses filled with dark red wine. Across from them sat my younger sister Brittany and her husband Terrence. They were hovering over a glossy luxury car catalog, laughing loudly at something Terrence had just pointed out. Comfortable bubble of privilege I was paying for. I cleared my throat. The sound cut through their laughter. 4 heads snapped in my direction. For a fraction of a second I saw genuine shock register on their faces. My mother lowered her wine glass, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem. "Nicole, what on earth are you doing here?" my mother asked. Her voice did not hold a single ounce of maternal warmth or relief at seeing her eldest daughter return safely from a grueling trip. Instead, she sounded deeply annoyed, like a tenant caught breaking rules by the landlord. "You were not supposed to be back until February." I ignored her question. My arms were aching from holding my son, but I refused to put him down. I looked directly at my sister. "Where is my son's bedroom, Brittany?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet. "Why is there a princess castle where his bed used to be, and why did I just find him locked in a freezing storage closet?" Brittany shifted uncomfortably on the couch, but my mother immediately stepped in to run interference. "Oh, for heaven's sake, stop being so dramatic, Nicole." My mother sighed, rolling her eyes as if my feverish child was merely a slight inconvenience. Brittany needed the space. Zoe is growing up so fast, and she needed a proper playroom to express her creativity. Leo is perfectly fine in the back room for a bit. It builds character. He is a boy, he does not need anything fancy. "He has a fever of 102 degrees, I stated flatly. "You left him on a bare mattress with cold rice." My father David finally spoke up, setting his wine glass on the coffee table. "Now, Nicole, you know we take good care of him. We are just teaching him not to be spoiled. Besides, you are making a massive deal out of a minor adjustment. We had to rearrange some things to accommodate Terrence in his new business meetings." Terrence scoffed loudly, flipping a page in his luxury catalog. "Honestly, Nicole, you travel constantly for your consulting gigs. You are a part-time mother anyway. You should be thanking us for keeping a roof over his head while you fly around pretending to be important. If it were not for us, he would be in some cheap daycare. You have no right to barge in here and dictate how this house is run when you are never even around." Growing up in this house had taught me that displaying any kind of emotional pain was just handing them ammunition, so I shut off my emotions entirely. I looked at the bottle of wine sitting on the table. It was a rare vintage that cost at least $200 a bottle. I looked at my mother's new diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the fireplace. I looked at Terrence's pristine designer shoes. Then I looked down at my son. His skin was burning my neck. He was wearing the same cheap faded t-shirt I had bought him from a discount bin 2 years ago. "I send you $4,000 on the first of every single month," I said. My voice was so completely devoid of emotion that the room went dead silent. $4,000. I specifically earmarked that money for Leo's groceries, his pediatrician co-pays, and his heating expenses. My mother crossed her arms defensively. "And we use it for the household, Nicole. We are a family. Rising tides lift all boats. Terrence is launching a massive lifestyle brand, and he needs to project an image of success to secure his seed funding. Brittany needs to maintain a certain standard of living to network with the right mothers at Zoe's preschool. You make an absurd amount of money with your consulting contracts. It is only fair that you share the wealth with the people who are actually doing the hard work of raising your child while you are away." "So you took my son's money," I stated, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. "You took the money. I break my back earning to ensure my child has a warm bed and fresh food. You took it to buy wine and jewelry and to fund the lifestyle of a grown man who refuses to get a real job." Terrence stood up abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "Watch your mouth, Nicole. I am the chief executive officer of a highly scalable luxury enterprise. You are just a corporate drone." "You are wiring that $4,000 this month, right?" my mother asked, interrupting him. She sounded completely unbothered by the fact that I had just uncovered their massive financial deception. "Because Terrence needs to put down the deposit on his new company vehicle next week, and we are hosting a major dinner party for his investors on Friday." I pulled Leo much tighter against my chest. I simply stared at the people who shared my blood and quickly realized they were nothing more than parasites. They had used my guilt as a working mother to extract every single cent they could get their hands on. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and it was going to hit them harder than any screaming match ever could. I did not drop my son to scream at them. I did not hurl the $200 bottle of wine against the wall, though every fiber of my being screamed to do just that. I knew yelling would only trigger their defensive gaslighting mechanisms, and right now, getting Leo to a hospital was my only priority. Instead, I shifted Leo's burning weight so I could reach into my coat pocket. I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a pale glow over my cold, steady hands. "What are you doing?" my mother asked, her voice laced with sudden apprehension. She recognized that look on my face. It was the same look I had when I negotiated multi-million-dollar hospital contracts. It was the look of someone shutting down negotiations and executing the kill switch. I opened my private banking app. As a high-earning consultant, I had structured my finances with absolute precision. The $4,000 a month I sent them was not just a simple transfer. It was routed through a revocable family trust I had set up years ago specifically for Leo's care and living expenses. I had generously issued my mother an authorized credit card linked to that trust under the strict legal stipulation that the funds were exclusively for my son. I tapped the security icon on my screen. A biometric scan confirmed my identity. With one single deliberate press of my thumb, I executed a total financial freeze. I locked the trust account, terminated all authorized user access, and instantly canceled the credit cards linked to my name. For exactly 3 seconds, the room was completely silent. Then the digital dominoes began to fall. My mother's phone, resting on the coffee table next to her wine glass, lit up with a rapid succession of urgent alerts. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was sharp and frantic. She frowned and picked it up. As her eyes scanned the notifications, the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and suddenly very old. "What is this?" she gasped, her voice rising in panic. "My platinum card just declined. The joint account is showing a 0 available balance." "Nicole, what is happening?" Before I could answer, Terrence's phone buzzed aggressively in his pocket. He pulled it out, and his arrogant smirk vanished instantly. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he stared at the screen. "What the hell?" he shouted. "My business account autodraft just failed. The server hosting fees for my app were just declined. My entire platform is going to crash. Brittany stood up, dropping the luxury catalog onto the floor. Nicole, what did you just do? She demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. I looked at the four of them standing there in their expensive clothes, surrounded by the luxury I had financed while my son lay freezing on concrete. The contrast was so grotesque it was almost comical. I just froze the trust account and canceled every single authorized card attached to my name, I said. My voice was eerily calm, cutting through their rising panic like a scalpel. I revoked your access to my money. All of it. Effective immediately. My father David finally stood up, his face turning an angry shade of red. You cannot do that, Nicole. We have bills to pay. The mortgage, the car leases. You cannot just cut us off without warning. We are your family. You stopped being my family the moment you locked my sick child in a freezing storage room so you could buy designer toys, I replied, stepping backward toward the hallway. You took the money meant to keep him safe, and you used it to fund a fake lifestyle. You are not family. You are thieves. My mother took a step toward me, her hands outstretched pleadingly. Nicole, please be reasonable. We can explain everything. Let us just sit down and talk about this. Do not make a rash decision. You know how important Terrence's business dinner is on Friday? We need those funds. I tightened my grip on Leo, who let out a soft, pained whimper against my neck. I am taking my son to the emergency room, I said. And while I am gone, I suggest you figure out how to pay for that wine and Zoe's custom-built princess room with your own money, because you will never see another dime from me for as long as you live. I turned my back on them and walked quickly down the hall. Behind me, the living room erupted into absolute chaos. I could hear Terrence cursing loudly about his failing servers, and Brittany sobbing about her pending credit card bills. My mother's panicked voice echoed off the walls as she desperately tried to calm them down while screaming my name. I ignored them all. I kicked the front door open and rushed out into the freezing winter night. The cold air hit my face, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me entirely focused. I gently placed Leo into the back seat of my rental car, wrapping him in my heavy winter coat and buckling the seatbelt over him. Hold on, baby, I whispered, kissing his burning forehead. Mommy has you. I promise they will never hurt you again. I slammed the car door shut, got into the driver's seat, and hit the gas. As I sped away from the house I had grown up in, I did not look back in the rearview mirror. My entire focus was on the road ahead and getting my son the medical care he desperately needed. The financial freeze was just the first step. They had weaponized my trust and endangered my child, and I was going to ensure they faced the full, brutal consequences of their actions. I drove to the nearest emergency room with reckless speed. My mind was entirely consumed by the sound of Leo's shallow, labored breathing from the back seat. Every time he whimpered or coughed, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. I pulled up to the emergency entrance parked haphazardly and carried him inside. The triage nurse took one look at his pale face and the way his chest was heaving and rushed us straight into a trauma bay. The next few hours were a blur of clinical efficiency and terrifying medical jargon. Doctors and nurses swarmed around us, attaching monitors, drawing blood, and starting an intravenous line. They placed a clear plastic oxygen mask over Leo's small face to help him breathe. The steady rhythmic hiss of the oxygen flowing into the mask was the only sound anchoring me to reality as I stood frozen in the corner of the room, watching strangers fight to stabilize my son. Dr. Eris, a stern-looking pediatrician with kind eyes, finally pulled me aside. Her expression was grim. Her clipboard was filled with notes that I knew were going to shatter my heart. Nicole, your son is very sick. He has severe bilateral pneumonia, meaning the infection has spread to both of his lungs. His oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low when you brought him in. We are starting him on broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics immediately, but he is going to need to stay in the pediatric intensive care unit for at least a few days so we can monitor his respiratory function. I nodded numbly. The words felt heavy hanging in the air between us. Will he be okay? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I needed her to tell me that my boy was going to survive this nightmare. Dr. Aris hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. He is a strong kid, but his immune system is significantly compromised. His blood work shows signs of mild malnutrition and dehydration. Nicole, I have to ask, has Leo been exposed to extreme cold or damp environments recently? Pneumonia this severe in a child his age, especially coupled with the signs of malnourishment, is highly unusual unless there are underlying environmental factors at play. The human body, especially a growing child's body, simply cannot fight off infection when it is constantly expending energy just trying to stay warm. The image of that freezing storage room, the bare mattress, and the plate of hard, cold rice flashed behind my eyes. I felt a surge of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the nearby counter to steady myself. The reality of what my parents had done was no longer just a horrifying discovery. It was a medical fact documented on a hospital chart. They had deliberately neglected my child to the point of endangering his life. Yes, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and escalating rage. I just discovered that the people I trusted to care for him have been forcing him to sleep in an unheated storage closet. I brought him here the second I found out. Dr. Iris's expression tightened. Her kind eyes hardened with professional concern. I see, she said, carefully jotting something down on her clipboard. I am going to document this in his chart, Nicole. It is important that we have a clear record of the environmental conditions that contributed to his current state. You did the right thing bringing him in when you did. A few more hours in that condition, and we could be looking at a very different outcome. I spent the rest of the night sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair next to Leo's hospital bed in the pediatric intensive care unit. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hiss of the oxygen mask were the only sounds in the dim room. I held his small, fragile hand in mine, watching his chest rise and fall with agonizing effort. The guilt was suffocating. It wrapped around my throat and squeezed until I could barely breathe. I had thought I was doing the right thing. I had taken that grueling consulting contract specifically to secure a massive bonus that would guarantee Leo's college fund. I had trusted my parents, my own flesh and blood, to care for my child. I had sent them $24,000 over the past 6 months, ensuring they had more than enough resources to provide him with a comfortable, loving environment. Instead, they had taken that money and weaponized it against him. They had transformed my financial support into a tool for their own vanity and greed. They had stripped my son of his bedroom, his warmth, and his basic human dignity, just to fund my sister's insatiable need to project a wealthy lifestyle. Every expensive bottle of wine my mother drank, every piece of designer clothing Brittany bought, and every dollar Terrence poured into his failing facade of a business had been paid for with my son's health and safety. I looked down at Leo's pale face illuminated by the harsh hospital monitors. A profound transformation was happening inside me. The guilt, the paralyzing fear, and the maternal panic were slowly burning away, leaving behind something much colder and far more dangerous. The shock of the betrayal was fading, replaced by a calculated, absolute rage. I was no longer just a terrified mother praying for her child to recover. I was a professional strategist who specialized in dismantling failing systems and holding people accountable. I had spent my entire career analyzing data, identifying weaknesses, and executing decisive action. My family thought they had found the perfect victim. They thought they could exploit my absence, drain my resources, and cast my child aside without consequence. They believed that because we shared the same blood, I would eventually fold, forgive them, and return to being their personal ATM. They were wrong. They had awoken a force they could not comprehend. I sat in that quiet hospital room and began to mentally draft a blueprint for their complete and total destruction. I was not going to yell. I was not going to argue. I was going to use every resource, every piece of evidence, and every legal avenue available to me to dismantle their lives piece by piece. The financial freeze was merely the opening move. The real war was about to begin, and I was not going to stop until they had lost absolutely everything. I walked out of the pediatric intensive care unit to grab a cup of black coffee from the cafeteria. My muscles ached from sitting in the rigid plastic chair all night, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. The hospital corridors were quiet in the early morning hours, filled only with the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes worn by the nursing staff. I just needed 5 minutes to clear my head and formulate the next phase of my plan. I reached the end of the hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors leading to the main waiting area. I heard them before I saw them. Loud, aggressive complaints echoing across the sterile lobby, disrupting the hushed atmosphere of the hospital. "Are you telling me she is not answering her phone?" Terrence barked, his voice vibrating with entitlement. "I am the chief executive officer of a growing brand. I do not have time to play hide-and-seek in a pediatric ward." My mother, Susan, chimed in, sounding exasperated rather than worried. "We drove all the way down here at 6 in the morning. She better fix this banking glitch immediately." I stepped around the corner and stood in the center of the corridor. The four of them were marching toward the reception desk. My father, David, was furiously tapping his smartphone screen. Brittany was clutching her designer handbag, looking utterly put out by the fact that she had to set foot inside a public hospital. None of them carried a teddy bear. None of them brought a balloon. None of them even looked mildly concerned about the fact that my 7-year-old son, their own flesh and blood, was currently fighting for his life, hooked up to an oxygen machine just 50 feet away. "I am right here," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, slicing through their chaotic complaints. They stopped in their tracks. For a fraction of a second, they looked like deer caught in headlights, but that hesitation vanished the moment Terrence spotted me. He did not ask how Leo was doing. He did not ask if my son was conscious. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides and pointed an aggressive manicured finger directly in my face. "Are you crazy?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly enough that a nearby security guard looked over. "Do you have any idea what you just did to me? My black card just declined at the dealership. I was sitting at the financing desk finalizing the paperwork for my new Tesla Cayenne. Do you know how humiliating it is to have your payment rejected in front of a luxury auto broker?" Brittany pushed past her husband, her face flushed with indignation. "And my accounts are completely locked, Nicole. I was at the online checkout for my upcoming vacation wardrobe, and everything was denied. The customer service representative treated me like a criminal. Turn the accounts back on right now." I stared at them, my expression entirely blank. "You came to a hospital emergency room at dawn because your luxury car deposit bounced?" I asked. The sheer audacity of their behavior was almost difficult to process. "You did not come to see if Leo survived the night." My father, David, stepped forward using his authoritative tone, the one he always used to shut down arguments when I was a teenager. "Now listen here, Nicole. You are acting incredibly selfish. We understand you were upset last night, but freezing the family trust is an extreme and unacceptable reaction. Terrence has investors to meet this afternoon. His startup needs that capital to maintain operations and project the right image. You cannot just throw a temper tantrum and sabotage his career." I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect his family. "You call locking a sick child in an unheated storage closet a minor issue that warrants a temper tantrum?" I asked. "The doctors diagnosed him with severe bilateral pneumonia. He is severely malnourished. He is breathing through a machine right now because his body is too weak to function on its own." My mother rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, please, Nicole, kids get sick all the time. You are blowing this completely out of proportion to punish us. We fed him. We gave him a place to sleep. It is not our fault he caught a winter bug. Now pull out your phone and unlock those cards. We have been incredibly patient with this little stunt of yours, but we have real adult responsibilities to handle today." The absolute lack of empathy was staggering. They had successfully convinced themselves that they were the victims in this scenario. They truly believed that my money was their money, and that my son's life was merely an annoying obstacle standing between them and their next luxury purchase. Terrence crossed his arms over his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. "Listen to your mother, Nicole. My business requires liquid capital. I am building a brand that will eventually support this entire family, including you and your kid. You are disrupting my cash flow over a common cold. Turn the accounts back on right this second, or I am going to hold you personally liable for my lost business opportunities." I looked Terrence up and down, taking in his expensive tailored coat and the flashy gold watch on his wrist. All of it bought and paid for with the money I had earned sweating through 80-hour work weeks in different time zones. Let me make this perfectly clear to all of you, I said, my voice echoing off the linoleum walls. I am never turning those accounts back on. The $4,000 a month I sent was legally designated for Leo's care. You committed wire fraud by diverting those funds into Terrence's failing business account. You committed child endangerment by neglecting my son's basic survival needs. The hospital has already documented his physical condition and the environmental factors that caused it. Brittany let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Wire fraud, she scoffed, crossing her arms. You gave Mom the card. We are family. You cannot claim fraud when you willingly handed over the access. You are just trying to scare us because you feel guilty about being a terrible absentee mother. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement. Exactly. You abandoned your son to chase a paycheck, Nicole. We stepped up to raise him. If anyone is guilty of neglect, it is you. You should be paying us a salary for the free childcare we provided while you were off playing corporate executive. The sheer delusion required to make that statement solidified my resolve. They were not just greedy, they were dangerous. They were entirely willing to rewrite reality to justify their abuse. I realized then that arguing with them was completely pointless. They would never take accountability. They would never apologize. They would only continue to demand more while tearing me down to elevate themselves. I took a step forward, closing the space between my mother and me. I looked deeply into her eyes, ensuring she saw the absolute lack of mercy waiting for her. Go buy your Tesla, Terrence. I whispered, my tone dripping with pure venom. Go buy your vacation clothes, Brittany. Let us see how exactly you plan to afford a criminal defense attorney for child endangerment when your pockets are completely empty. Terrence lunged forward a step, but the hospital security guard had finally seen enough and began walking briskly down the corridor toward us. Sir, I need you to step back from her, the guard warned, placing a hand on his radio. Terrence sneered at me but took a step back, holding his hands up in mock surrender. You are making a massive mistake, Nicole. He threatened, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can just cut us off and walk away? We know things about you. We know how to ruin your perfect little professional reputation. My father grabbed Terrence's arm, pulling him back. We are leaving, David announced, shooting me a look of pure disgust. You have 1 hour to fix this bank issue, Nicole. If those cards are not working by the time we get home, we are going to teach you a very painful lesson about family loyalty. I watched them turn around and march out through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room lobby. They piled into my father's luxury sedan, a vehicle I now realized I had likely helped finance through their systematic theft. They drove away without a single backward glance, without one final question about whether the little boy fighting for his life upstairs was going to survive the day. I stood alone in the hallway, taking a deep, stabilizing breath. The ambush was exactly what I needed to confirm my next steps. They had shown their hand. They cared only about the money, and they were willing to use threats and intimidation to get it back. They thought they had the upper hand because they believed I was still the compliant daughter who would eventually cave to their demands to keep the peace. I turned around and walked back toward the intensive care unit. My phone felt heavy in my pocket. It was time to make some calls of my own. I needed a forensic accountant who could track every single stolen penny, and I needed the most ruthless family law attorney in the state of Connecticut. The warning shot had been fired and ignored. Now it was time to drop the bomb. My cell phone vibrated in my hand. My father's name flashed. I pressed accept and listened to the angry breathing. Listen to me, my father David shouted. We are stuck at the hospital garage because Terrence's payment app was rejected. You are humiliating us. You need to fix this right now before you cause permanent damage to this family. Permanent damage, I repeated. You mean the damage your grandson might suffer because you forced him into a freezing storage closet? My father let out a harsh, disgusted breath. Terrence needs to project wealth for his investors, David yelled. You are just a consultant, you travel all the time. The least you can do is fund the family. The sheer audacity of his words washed over me, confirming everything I had ever suspected about my role in their lives. I was not a daughter. I was a bank account, a financial stepping stone. My father continued his relentless verbal assault. I listened quietly. We had to use that money to maintain the household, Nicole. Brittany needed clothing. $4,000 a month is nothing compared to the sacrifices we make dealing with your absence. I stood frozen by the hospital elevator, letting the absolute truth of his confessions sink in. The reality was utterly sickening. The $4,000 I wired on the first of every month was specifically calculated and designated for Leo's survival. It was meant to cover his expensive organic groceries, his pediatric asthma medications, proper winter clothing, and an agreed-upon portion of the heating bill to ensure the house stayed warm. Instead, they had systematically stolen it to fund a fraudulent existence. I realized with absolute clarity that my hard-earned money had been financing Terrence's fake tech bro lifestyle. The luxury car deposits, the designer watches, the overpriced business lunches at Michelin-starred restaurants, it was all paid for with Leo's grocery money, and Brittany was no better. Her endless shopping addictions, the luxury handbags she flaunted on social media, the expensive salon appointments, and the custom-built princess suite for her daughter were entirely subsidized by my son's suffering. They had literally taken the food out of a 7-year-old boy's mouth so they could pretend to be wealthy. "You stole it," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was solid ice. "You committed wire fraud. You took money designated for a minor's medical and living expenses, and you diverted it for personal luxury goods. It is not stealing when it is family," my father snapped back, completely missing the severity of his admission. "We get to decide how the household funds are allocated. If you wanted to micromanage his diet, you should have stayed home like a real mother instead of chasing promotions. You owe us that money, Nicole. Turn the cards back on, or we will take you to court for child support as his primary caregivers. We will tell the judge you abandoned him." I let out a cold, humorless laugh. Walk into a courtroom and explain to a judge why my son is hooked up to an oxygen machine with bilateral pneumonia, while your other daughter posts pictures of her designer bags. Show the judge the receipts for Terrence's luxury car lease paid directly from the trust account I set up for my child's health care. I am sure a federal prosecutor would love to see how you allocate household funds. "Do not threaten me," my father bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "You are nothing without this family. You will die alone with your bank accounts and your empty career." "I am already alone," I replied. "But my son is going to survive, and he is going to have a mother who burns your entire fake empire to the ground to protect him. Do not ever call this number again." I disconnected the call and blocked his number. I stood in the hospital corridor feeling an incredible surge of power. The guilt that had haunted me for months, all of it evaporated. They had handed me the exact confession I needed. They had admitted to the financial diversion, and they had confirmed their extreme neglect. I opened my phone and dialed the number for a private wealth management attorney I had worked with on a previous corporate merger. He was notorious for being ruthless, brilliant, and utterly merciless in financial disputes. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Daniel," I said, keeping my tone completely professional. "I need to hire your firm for a personal matter. I have a case of severe financial exploitation, wire fraud, and child endangerment involving a family trust. I need a forensic team mobilized immediately, and I need to file for an emergency protective order." "Consider it done, Nicole," he replied, recognizing the urgency in my voice. "Send me whatever documentation you currently have." I ended the call and walked into the elevator, pressing the button for the pediatric intensive care unit. The battle lines were drawn. My father thought he could bully me into submission by attacking my insecurities as a mother. He thought throwing Brittany's supposed devotion in my face would make me crumble. He underestimated the woman I had become. They wanted to project wealth and status. I was going to ensure everyone saw them for the parasitic abusers they truly were. I stepped off the elevator and slowly walked back into my son Leo's hospital room. He was now sleeping peacefully, the clear oxygen mask hissing steadily. I sat down in the plastic chair and began compiling the trail of my payments. Every wire transfer, every text message confirming the funds were for his care, every medical bill. I was building an arsenal, and when I finally fired, they would not have a foundation left to stand on. This was no longer a simple family dispute. This was a highly calculated financial and legal war. They had taken everything for granted, but their absolute greed would destroy them. The heavy sound of the intensive care unit doors swinging open interrupted my concentration. Despite my instructions to the front desk, my parents, alongside Brittany and Terrence, managed to bypass security. They marched into the family waiting area outside Leo's room, their faces twisted in pure rage. My father shook his smartphone furiously. Realizing his number was blocked, pushed him over the edge. I stood placing my laptop down. I held the thick folder given by the attending physician. It contained Leo's preliminary medical report. It detailed the severe malnutrition, the acute bilateral pneumonia, and the direct correlation to freezing temperatures. The social worker had officially flagged the case for severe child neglect. Terrence crossed the floor. "You think blocking our numbers changes anything?" he spat. "My investors expect a proof of funds confirmation by noon. The luxury dealership is canceling my Tesla allocation because the wire bounced. Turn the accounts back on right now, Nicole, or I will make you regret it." I looked at him with detachment. "My son is fighting to breathe, and your concern is your car allocation," I asked. My mother pushed past Terrence. "Do not turn this around on us, Nicole. We gave up our peace to accommodate your lifestyle choices. The least you owe us is financial stability. Unfreeze those accounts right this second." I raised the folder. "I am not unfreezing anything," I said with absolute finality. "This folder contains official medical documentation. It details what happens to a boy locked in an unheated closet during winter. It proves his pneumonia is a direct result of environmental neglect. It is a legal medical assessment of child abuse." I turned my gaze directly to my brother-in-law. I watched the arrogant smirk on his face falter for just a fraction of a second. "Go buy your Tesla, Terrence," I said, keeping my tone completely even. "Let us see how you afford a criminal defense lawyer for child endangerment when your bank accounts are completely empty and your investors realize your entire company is funded by stolen child support money." My father took a step back, his face draining of color. "You would not dare," David stammered. "You would not ruin your own family over a misunderstanding." "It was not a misunderstanding," I corrected him sharply. "It was a calculated decision to torture a child so you could pretend to be rich. And I am going to hand this file directly to the police." Brittany pushed her way to the front of the group. Her face was contorted into an ugly sneer of pure entitlement. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with absolute contempt. "You are bluffing," she snapped. "You think you can intimidate us with a piece of paper. Go ahead and call the police, Nicole. Call them right now. Do you honestly think the cops will believe a single mother who abandons her kid for months on end to travel for work over a respectable traditional family living in a wealthy suburb?" She took another step closer, pointing her manicured finger at my chest. "We have roots in that community. We have standing. You are just an absentee mother who threw money at her problems because she did not want to do the hard work of parenting. When the authorities get involved, we will tell them you neglected him. We will say he was sick when you dropped him off and we did our best to save him. We will take full legal custody of Leo. We will ensure a judge sees exactly what kind of selfish, career-obsessed monster you truly are, and we will drain you for child support legally for the rest of your life." The sheer level of delusion required to make that threat was staggering. Brittany truly believed that her curated social media presence and her husband's fake executive title would shield them from federal wire fraud and felony child abuse charges. They had lived inside their own echo chamber of lies for so long that they thought the legal system operated on the same superficial rules as their country club. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared her down, matching her toxic energy with a wall of absolute freezing silence. The truth was, they had no idea what kind of power I held. They had no idea I possessed the full financial records proving their theft. They had no idea I owned the very house they slept in. They thought I was just a weak target, but they were bringing a plastic knife to a nuclear war. I slowly lowered the folder and reached into my pocket. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the hospital security desk. I had memorized the extension earlier when the triage nurse provided the safety protocols. Yes, I said, speaking clearly into the receiver while maintaining direct eye contact with my sister. I am in the pediatric intensive care unit family waiting area. I have 4 individuals here who are trespassing and actively threatening the mother of a critical patient. They are suspects in a child abuse case. I need them removed from the premises immediately, and I need a police officer dispatched to file an official report of harassment. Brittany gasped, taking a quick step backward. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in horror. Terrence suddenly looked like a man who realized the ground beneath him was collapsing. "You are a monster," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with genuine panic as the heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open, revealing 3 large security guards flanked by an armed hospital police officer. "No," I replied, turning my back on them and walking toward the secure doors of my son's unit. "I am a mother, and you are out of time. I will burn your entire fake world down to absolute ashes to protect him, and I will never ever feel any remorse." I returned to the sterile silence of the pediatric intensive care unit, leaving the chaos of my family in the hallway. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, sealing away the toxic noise of their entitlement. I sat back down in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside my son's bed and watched his small chest rise and fall. The antibiotics were slowly beginning to fight the severe pneumonia, but Leo still looked incredibly fragile. I spent the rest of the night awake, monitoring every beep of the machines and finalizing the mental blueprint for my retaliation. Morning arrived with the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital shifting to the pale gray of a winter dawn. As the sun rose, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the metal tray table. Text messages flooded my screen from extended family members, former neighbors, and distant acquaintances. I unlocked my device and opened my social media applications to find the source of the sudden digital uproar. My sister Brittany had wasted absolutely no time executing her threat to control the narrative. She had posted a highly curated tear-jerking photograph on her Instagram account. The image showed her standing outside the hospital entrance, huddled together with Terrence and my parents, looking flawlessly distressed. They were all bundled in their expensive winter coats, staring solemnly at the camera. In her manicured hand, Brittany held a massive designer coffee from an upscale cafe down the street. I knew immediately she had used our Aunt Carol's emergency credit card to buy those overpriced lattes, since I had frozen all of their primary financial access just hours earlier. The caption beneath the photograph was a masterpiece of narcissistic manipulation. "Praying for my sweet little nephew this morning. It is so incredibly hard stepping up to raise a child when their real mother cares more about her corporate career than her own family. We have sacrificed everything to give him a loving traditional home while she travels the world. But sometimes a child's immune system just gives out from the stress of a broken household. Please send prayers for our family during this devastating crisis." The comments section was already a toxic wasteland of misplaced sympathy and aggressive outrage directed entirely at me. Relatives who had not spoken to me in years were praising Brittany for her selfless devotion. Strangers were condemning the selfish absentee mother who prioritized money over her sick child. They called me a monster, a failure, and a disgrace to motherhood. A year ago, seeing my reputation publicly shredded by my own sister would have sent me into a spiral of defensive anxiety. I would have drafted a dozen frantic replies, trying to explain my side of the story and begging people to believe the truth. But that woman died the moment I found my son shivering on a concrete floor. I did not shed a single tear over the online hate. I did not type a single angry response to defend myself against their coordinated character assassination. Instead, I methodically took high-resolution screenshots of the post, the caption, and every single defamatory comment made by my family members. I cataloged the timestamps and saved the images to a secure cloud server. Brittany thought she was winning a public relations battle on social media, but she was actually handing me meticulously documented evidence of public defamation and libel. She was digging her own grave, and I was perfectly content to let her keep shoveling. I set my phone down and turned my attention to assembling the absolute best arsenal money could buy. I needed professionals who operated with the same cold clinical detachment that I used in my corporate negotiations. Sitting directly beside Leo's hospital bed, I opened my secure work laptop and bypassed local attorneys entirely. I accessed my elite corporate network and reached out to a top-tier family law attorney based out of the city. His name was Elias, and he possessed a reputation for utterly destroying his opponents in court with brutal financial precision. He did not negotiate settlements, he dismantled lives. I sent Elias a secure encrypted email outlining the exact parameters of the situation. I detailed the unauthorized diversion of funds, the resulting medical emergency, the documented child neglect, and the current smear campaign unfolding on social media. I attached the preliminary hospital reports and the screenshots of Brittany's posts. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Elias did not offer empty platitudes or waste time expressing useless sympathy. He accepted the case immediately and outlined a devastating legal strategy that would trap them in a corner they could never escape. With the legal representation secured, I moved to the next critical phase of my retaliation. I needed an irrefutable paper trail to prove that every single luxury item my family flaunted was purchased with stolen child support. I contacted Victor, a ruthless independent forensic accountant, who frequently contracted with my consulting firm to uncover corporate embezzlement. Victor was a digital bloodhound who could track a single stolen dollar through a dozen shell companies. I granted Victor absolute access to the historical data of the revocable family trust I had established for Leo. I instructed him to tear apart Terrence's self-proclaimed luxury startup limited liability company. I wanted every bank transfer, every automated teller machine withdrawal, every designer clothing purchase, and every restaurant receipt pulled from the ether and mapped out on a spreadsheet. I told Victor to specifically look for federal wire fraud violations, tracing how the funds crossed state lines through banking applications to fund Terrence's fake chief executive officer lifestyle. By noon, my arsenal was fully loaded and locked. I had the medical evidence of their abuse, the legal firepower to prosecute them, and the forensic tracking to prove their theft beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt. My family thought they had backed me into a corner by weaponizing public opinion against me, but they were entirely wrong about my plans. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in strategic execution. I remained at Leo's bedside, dividing my time between monitoring his oxygen levels and coordinating with my newly assembled team of professionals. Dr. Aris confirmed that Leo's pneumonia was responding well to the aggressive intravenous antibiotics, and his fever had finally broken. The relief of knowing my son was out of immediate danger sharpened my focus. I was no longer operating purely on adrenaline. I was operating on cold, hard data. Victor, the forensic accountant I had retained, delivered his preliminary report late Tuesday afternoon. He sent it through an encrypted server marked with high-priority flags. I opened the file on my laptop while Leo slept peacefully beside me. I expected to find evidence of financial mismanagement and selfish spending, but the sheer scale and audacity of their theft left me momentarily breathless. The $24,000 I had wired into the revocable family trust over the past 6 months had been completely drained. Victor had meticulously tracked every transaction, categorizing the expenditures with ruthless clarity. The breakdown was nauseating. According to the audit, Brittany had spent over $8,000 on luxury goods. There were receipts for a vintage Hermes Birkin bag purchased through an online resale boutique, multiple charges at high-end designer shoe stores, and a series of transactions at an exclusive medical spa in Manhattan, where she received regular chemical peels and laser treatments. My parents, David and Susan, had used their portion of the stolen funds to subsidize their country club dues, pay off a lingering tax lien on their Connecticut home, and purchase a pair of first-class tickets for an upcoming anniversary trip to the Amalfi Coast. But Terrence's financial maneuvers were the most damning. Victor had uncovered that Terrence was not merely withdrawing cash. He was actively laundering the trust funds through his fake luxury lifestyle startup. Terrence had set up an elaborate series of automatic transfers, routing the money from the family trust directly into a limited liability company registered under his name. He then used those funds to pay off fraudulent high-interest business loans he had taken out from unregulated lenders. He was desperately trying to keep his phantom company afloat by injecting stolen child support money into its failing infrastructure. The most disturbing section of Victor's report, however, pertained directly to Leo. Victor had isolated every single transaction made at grocery stores or pharmacies during the entire 6-month period. The total amount spent on items that could reasonably be considered food or supplies for a child was less than $300. That broke down to a pathetic $50 a month. They had been feeding my son discounted canned soup and cheap boxed macaroni while dining on imported steaks and rare vintages of wine. They had effectively starved him to fund their vanity. I closed the report, my hands trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and escalating fury. This was not just a case of family members taking advantage of my generosity. This was a systematic, calculated exploitation of a vulnerable child. My phone rang, breaking the heavy silence of the hospital room. It was Elias, the family law attorney. He had just finished reviewing Victor's audit. Nicole, Elias began, his voice lacking any trace of standard legal pleasantries. I have read the report. Your family is entirely detached from reality if they think they can survive this. I am looking at the grocery expenditures right now, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. $50 a month, Elias. They fed him garbage while wearing designer clothes. I saw that Elias replied. It is abhorrent, but it is also the final nail in their coffin regarding the child endangerment case. However, the financial aspect is where we are going to completely obliterate them. Terrence made a fatal error. What did he do? I asked, leaning closer to the phone. Elias let out a short, humorless laugh. He got greedy and he tried to play the tax code. By routing the funds from your family trust directly into his limited liability company to pay off his business loans, he engaged in the illegal transfer of funds across state lines using electronic banking networks. He then attempted to classify those stolen funds as legitimate business revenue to write off his taxes. I absorbed the information, my mind quickly connecting the dots. Are you telling me he committed a federal crime? I asked. Elias paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. I am telling you that Terrence committed textbook federal wire fraud. The moment he transferred that money across state lines under false pretenses, he elevated this from a civil dispute over misallocated family funds into a federal felony. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not care about family dynamics, Nicole. They care about fraudulent business structures and tax evasion. He is facing serious mandatory minimum sentencing. And my parents, I asked, what is their exposure? They are complicit, Elias stated bluntly. They were authorized users on the trust account, and they actively participated in the depletion of the funds for personal luxury expenses, while demonstrably neglecting the primary beneficiary. They are accessories to financial exploitation, and they are the primary suspects in the child neglect case. The entire fragile empire my family had built upon lies and stolen money was sitting on a foundation of gasoline, and Elias had just handed me the match. What is our next move? I asked, watching Leo's chest rise and fall. We secure absolute legal authority, Elias instructed. First, we finalize the emergency protective order barring any of them from coming within 500 feet of you or Leo. Second, we submit this entire forensic audit directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the State Prosecutor's Office. We do not warn them. We do not threaten them. We simply hand the loaded gun to the authorities and let the federal government do the heavy lifting. I agreed immediately. Elias promised to have the protective order signed by a judge before the end of the day. I ended the call feeling a dark, satisfying sense of control returning to me. My family thought they could dictate the terms of this engagement. They thought they could shame me into submission. They were about to learn that when you push a mother into a corner, she does not negotiate. She eliminates the threat entirely. The digital assault began at 8 o'clock the following morning. My parents, realizing they were cut off from my financial lifelines, activated their network of enablers. My phone lit up with an endless stream of text messages and furious voicemails from extended family members, fed a highly fabricated version of events. David and Susan spent the night calling every aunt and uncle, playing the role of destitute victims abandoned by their daughter. I sat next to Leo's hospital bed, sipping coffee, and pressed play on the first voicemail. It was my Aunt Brenda, who lived in a neighboring wealthy suburb. Her voice trembled with performative outrage. "Nicole, I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior. Your poor mother called me sobbing at midnight. How could you financially abuse your elderly parents? They sacrificed their peace to raise your son while you were off chasing money, and you repay them by freezing their accounts. You need to fix this immediately before you destroy this family." The next voicemail was from my Uncle Thomas. He sounded equally furious. "I always knew your career made you arrogant, Nicole, but cutting off your father when Terrence is on the verge of a major business breakthrough is pure sabotage. Your parents are on fixed incomes. You are engaging in elder abuse. Turn the credit cards back on and apologize." There were a dozen more messages just like those. They called me a narcissist and a financial abuser. They accused me of hoarding wealth while my family suffered. In the past, a coordinated attack from my extended family would have sent me into a panic. I would have felt the crushing weight of their disapproval and scrambled to justify my actions and beg for understanding. But sitting in the pediatric intensive care unit, looking at the bruising on my son's arms, I felt nothing but a deep, resonating calm. Their words held no power over me anymore. My parents had spun a masterful web of lies, portraying themselves as selfless martyrs who rescued my neglected child. They conveniently omitted locking him in a freezing storage unit and stealing his food money to buy designer handbags and cars. I did not reply to a single text. I simply forwarded every voicemail directly to a secure folder labeled Evidence. Every angry threat and false accusation was another brick in the fortress I was building against them. By 10 o'clock, Dr. Eris entered the room with a cautious smile. Leo's oxygen levels were stabilizing. His fever was down and the antibiotics were clearing the fluid from his lungs. He was going to be fine. He was safe, surrounded by professional medical staff and protected by hospital security, who had strict orders to arrest my family if they stepped foot on the premises. With Leo resting comfortably under the watchful eye of a private pediatric nurse, I knew it was time to leave the hospital. The defensive phase was over. It was time to launch the offensive strike. I changed out of my wrinkled clothes and put on a tailored charcoal suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek knot and applied my makeup with military precision. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a grieving, terrified mother. I saw a consultant preparing to liquidate a failing hostile entity. I drove downtown to the financial district, parking beneath a towering skyscraper. Elias, my family law attorney, operated his practice out of the top floor. The receptionist escorted me instantly into a massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Elias was waiting at a heavy mahogany conference table. He had a stack of files containing the forensic accountant's audit regarding Terrence's wire fraud and my parents' complicity in the theft. "You look ready for war," Nicole Elias said, gesturing for me to take the seat across from him. "We have the Financial Crimes Division ready to receive the wire fraud documentation. The child endangerment report from the hospital is finalized. We can drop the hammer by the end of the week." I sat down and placed my briefcase on the polished wood table. "We are going to drop the hammer," I agreed, my voice echoing slightly. "But the federal charges and the Child Protective Services investigation are just the beginning. I want them to lose everything, Elias. I want the ground ripped out from underneath them so completely that they never recover." Elias raised an eyebrow, intrigued by my absolute lack of mercy. "What else is there?" he asked. "They have zero liquid assets. Their credit is entirely dependent on your previously authorized accounts. They have nothing left for us to take." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, guarded black folder. I had kept this secret for 5 years, protecting my parents' pride at the expense of my own sanity. I slid the folder across the table. Elias opened it and began to read. I watched his eyes scan the complex legal jargon, the limited liability company registrations, the property deeds, and the financial transfer records. Slowly, a sharp predatory smile spread across Elias's face. He looked up at me holding a certified deed of trust. "Nicole," he said, his voice laced with genuine awe. "They really do not know you are the actual owner of the house they live in, do they?" I leaned back and crossed my arms. "No, they do not," I replied softly. 5 years ago, they bankrupted themselves trying to keep up appearances at their country club. They were 60 days away from total foreclosure and homelessness. I stepped in and bought the debt through a blind limited liability company to save their social standing. I let them believe they were renting the property from a faceless corporate landlord. They have no idea that every month they have been living under my roof. They think they have the high ground because they have a home in Connecticut. They are about to find out they are nothing but terrible tenants. Elias stared at the paperwork on his massive desk. For a man who built a lucrative career destroying wealthy families in court, he actually looked stunned. He picked up the original deed of trust, holding it up to the light. "You bought $1 million estate in the exclusive suburb of Connecticut and let your parents pretend they were still the masters of their domain," he said. "The level of restraint that requires is terrifying, Nicole." I rested my elbows on the table. It was about containment, Elias. 5 years ago, my father made disastrous investments trying to maintain his country club membership and subsidize Brittany's lavish wedding to Terrence. The bank was ready to seize the property and throw them out. If they became homeless, they would expect to move into my city apartment. I needed a permanent barrier. So I formed a blind limited liability company, purchased the foreclosed debt directly from the bank, and became their anonymous corporate landlord. I subsidized their rent to keep them geographically contained and out of my daily life. Elias let out a low whistle, scanning the redacted lease agreement I forced them to sign through a proxy property management firm. "You executed a strict corporate lease," he noted, tapping his pen against the thick parchment. "Corporate leases have incredibly rigid covenants regarding the use of the premises. Tell me about the specific clauses regarding illegal activity and unauthorized structural alterations." I said, my expression entirely devoid of warmth. Elias flipped to the third page, tracking the dense legal text. "Right here," he said, circling a paragraph with his luxury pen. "Section 7 explicitly prohibits any illegal or criminal activity on the premises. Section 9 strictly forbids structural modifications, painting, or room conversions without written authorization from the holding company." He looked up with a predatory gleam in his eye. "Converting a standard bedroom into a custom-built luxury playroom without landlord approval is a direct massive violation of Section 9. And locking a sick child in an unheated storage closet causing severe pneumonia falls under Section 7, I added. It is criminal child endangerment occurring directly on the leased property. They broke the lease the absolute second they compromised my son's health." Elias buzzed his paralegal, instructing her to clear his schedule for the next hour. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and began drafting the aggressive eviction notice. "Because the breach of contract involves criminal neglect and property destruction, we do not have to give them a standard 30-day cure period." Elias explained, his pen moving rapidly. "I am drafting an unconditional 48-hour notice to vacate. They cannot pay a fine to fix this. Their tenancy is officially permanently terminated." I watched him draft the document, feeling profound vindication. For 5 long years, I allowed my parents to walk around that massive house acting superior. They threw extravagant dinner parties and bragged to their wealthy neighbors about their pristine real estate while looking down at my consulting career. They treated me like a disappointing guest whenever I visited the very property I owned and paid for. "Print it on your most intimidating legal letterhead," I instructed. "I want the eviction notice to look like an absolute death sentence." "But, Elias, do not serve it to them yet." Elias paused, looking up from his drafting pad. "You do not want the local sheriff to staple this to their front door this afternoon?" he asked, clearly puzzled by my restraint. "We have the legal authority to execute this strike right now, Nicole. We could have them sleeping in a cheap roadside motel by tomorrow night." I shook my head, leaning back in my leather chair. If we serve the eviction notice today, they will panic and scatter. They will claim they are innocent victims of a heartless corporate entity and solicit donations from our extended family network. I do not want them to scatter, Elias. I want them to gather. I want them to feel completely secure right up until the exact second I pull the ground out from under their feet. My sister Brittany and Terrence are highly predictable, I continued. They are desperate for money and just realized I froze their primary funding source. When toxic people lose their financial supply, they do not surrender quietly. They retaliate. They are going to try to hit me where it hurts the most. They are going to use the government to come after my son. Elias frowned, setting his pen down. You think they will weaponize the authorities against you? I am absolutely certain, I said, checking my watch. Terrence is arrogant enough to think he can outsmart me, and Brittany is vindictive enough to play the victim card. They are drafting a fake report to Child Protective Services right now. They will accuse me of abandoning my child to secure emergency custody of Leo so they can legally force me to pay them monthly child support. They want to turn my son into a permanent paycheck. Elias narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers against the table. If they involve Child Protective Services, things could get very complicated very fast, Nicole. The state takes abandonment allegations extremely seriously. Let them call the state, I replied, my voice completely steady. I have the pediatric intensive care unit medical records. I have the forensic financial audit proving they stole his care money to buy luxury goods. I have my elite employment contract proving my professional standing and stable income. If they bring a government investigator into this fight, they are simply bringing a federal witness to their own execution. Elias smiled, genuinely impressed by the sheer calculation of the overall strategy. He finished reviewing the eviction draft and slid it into a thick manila envelope, sealing it with a stark red label. He handed the envelope across the table. The 48-hour notice to vacate is completely ready, he said. The deed of trust is included inside, confirming your ownership. Whenever you decide to drop this bomb, Nicole, there will be absolutely no survivors. I took the envelope, feeling the incredibly heavy weight of the thick paper in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate retaliation. I slid it carefully into my leather briefcase, snapping the metallic lock shut with a sharp click. The legal traps were meticulously set. The documents were finalized. All I had to do right now was wait for them to make their next disastrous mistake. I took a car back to the hospital. The eviction notice sat secured in my briefcase. The trap was set. I just needed them to walk into it. The nurses who had been warm earlier now offered tight, strained smiles. The charge nurse avoided my eyes. I sensed the invisible shift in the ecosystem. Something was wrong. I pushed open the door to Leo's room. My son was sitting up slightly against the pillows watching a cartoon. His color was much better, and the heavy mask had been replaced by a nasal cannula. He gave me a weak smile. I sat beside him and kissed his forehead, feeling profound relief that his temperature had returned to normal. Before I could even ask him how he was feeling, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Elias. I stepped out into the hallway to take the call, keeping a watchful eye on Leo through the glass door. They took the bait, Elias said, his voice devoid of surprise. My office received a notification through our legal monitoring system. Terrence and Brittany filed a report with Child Protective Services this morning. They also filed an emergency petition seeking temporary guardianship of your son. I leaned against the cool cinderblock wall. The sheer audacity of their extortion attempt was almost breathtaking. They actually did it, I said. They are trying to legally steal my child to force me into paying them child support. They are claiming you abandoned Leo for months to pursue a corporate career and deliberately withheld financial support, causing his crisis, Elias said. They explicitly requested the state mandate you to pay them foster guardianship stipends and cover their legal fees. They want to turn your son into a permanent paycheck. The state investigator is likely already on her way to the hospital. Let her come, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Tell the Financial Crimes Division to stand by. I will call you when the investigator has their full fabricated statement. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy double doors swung open. A woman in a gray pantsuit walked onto the floor. She wore a state identification badge and carried a thick digital tablet. She possessed the hardened demeanor of someone who dealt with the absolute worst of humanity daily. She approached the nurse's station, spoke briefly with the charge nurse, and then turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. I did not flinch. I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my blazer, and met her eyes with absolute confidence. "Are you Nicole?" she asked, stopping a few feet away from me. Her tone was strictly professional, completely devoid of warmth. "I am," I replied, extending my hand. She did not take it. "I am Investigator Thompson with the Department of Child and Family Services," she stated, holding up her badge for my inspection. "I am here to conduct an emergency inquiry regarding the welfare and legal custody of your son Leo. We received a highly detailed report this morning alleging severe child neglect, medical endangerment, and prolonged physical abandonment." I kept my hands clasped loosely in front of me, projecting total transparency. "I understand, Investigator Thompson. I am fully prepared to cooperate with your inquiry. What exactly are the allegations against me?" She tapped her tablet. "The reporting parties state you left your son in their care 3 months ago and ceased communication. They claim you failed to provide financial support for his basic needs, resulting in his severe malnutrition and pneumonia. Furthermore, they allege you showed up today, threatened them, and attempted to forcibly remove the child against medical advice. They are seeking emergency custody to protect him from your negligence." The sheer volume of their lies was staggering. They had taken every single crime they committed and masterfully projected it onto me. They thought that by striking first, they could control the narrative and blindside me. They believed a busy state worker would take one look at a wealthy suburban family and instantly side with them over a traveling single mother. "Are the reporting parties my sister Brittany and her husband Terrence?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Investigator Thompson narrowed her eyes. "I cannot disclose the identity of the mandated reporters, but I can confirm that the individuals seeking emergency guardianship are currently waiting in the first-floor lobby. They have provided a very compelling initial statement and have offered to house the child immediately upon discharge." I looked past her and through the glass windows, looking down toward the main atrium. Sitting in the plush chairs of the hospital lobby were my parents, David and Susan. They were putting on an absolute masterclass in theatrical grief. Susan dabbed her eyes with a tissue, while David rubbed her back with manufactured devastation. They were waiting down there to corroborate every single lie Brittany and Terrence spun. They were ready to testify to a government official that their daughter was an abusive monster just to secure their financial pipeline. Investigator Thompson followed my gaze down to the lobby. "Your parents are extremely distressed," she noted, her voice softening just a fraction. "They expressed deep concern about your mental stability and your capacity to safely parent this boy. They are begging the state to intervene before a tragedy occurs." I turned back to the investigator. My expression was a mask of impenetrable calm. "I understand exactly what they are doing. They are staging a very convincing performance, but I operate on evidence." I gestured toward the private consultation room across the hall. "Would you please step into this room with me? I have documentation that will significantly alter the trajectory of your investigation." Investigator Thompson raised a skeptical eyebrow, clearly used to defensive parents making empty promises. She adjusted her grip on her tablet. "Documentation regarding what exactly?" "Regarding the $24,000 I wired directly to them for my son's care over the last 6 months," I replied, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Regarding the federal wire fraud they committed to steal it, and regarding the precise hospital medical records proving they locked my child in a freezing storage unit while purchasing luxury cars." Her professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of genuine shock. She looked at me, then looked down at the theatrical performance happening in the lobby below. "Show me," she said. I nodded and walked toward the consultation room. The extortion attempt had officially begun, but my family had no idea I was holding the trigger to the guillotine. I led Investigator Thompson into the small windowless consultation room just off the main hallway of the pediatric intensive care unit. The room was sparsely furnished with a round table and a few uncomfortable chairs designed for delivering bad news. I took a seat and gestured for her to do the same. I placed my leather briefcase on the table but did not open it immediately. I needed to know exactly what narrative my family was attempting to sell to the state before I systematically dismantled it. Investigator Thompson sat across from me, opening her digital tablet. Before you show me your documentation, Nicole, I need you to understand the severity of the allegations being made against you. She began, her tone remaining strictly professional. Your parents and your sister are painting a very disturbing picture of your parenting. I leaned back in my chair, projecting an aura of complete calm. I can only imagine, Investigator Thompson. Please tell me exactly what my mother Susan claimed when she spoke to you. Thompson tapped her screen, pulling up her notes. Susan stated that you unexpectedly dropped Leo off at their house 3 months ago, prioritizing a lucrative consulting contract over your son's well-being. She claims you refused to provide adequate financial support for his care, forcing them to rely on their own fixed incomes. According to her statement, you explicitly instructed them to keep the thermostat turned down to save money, which she believes directly contributed to his severe pneumonia. A short, humorless laugh escaped my lips. I see. And did she explain why he was sleeping on a bare mattress in an unheated storage closet? Susan claims that was a temporary arrangement. Thompson read from her notes. She stated that you demanded they downsize his living space because you felt he was becoming too spoiled and needed to learn discipline. She said she argued with you about it, but you threatened to cut off all contact if they did not comply. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My mother was actually trying to convince a state investigator that I, a mother who earned a mid-six-figure salary, had ordered my parents to freeze my child to teach him a lesson. It was a desperate attempt to explain away the physical evidence of their abuse by projecting it entirely onto me. And what about my brother-in-law, Terrence? I asked. What was his contribution to this performance? Thompson scrolled down her tablet. Terrence was quite vocal. He stated that your demanding career makes you an unfit and absentee mother. He claims you are emotionally unstable and prone to erratic behavior, which he says was evidenced by your sudden appearance at their home last night. He reported that you burst in making threats, screaming obscenities, and forcibly removing Leo against their strong objections. He is formally requesting that the state place Leo in their emergency custody to protect him from your quote-unquote volatile nature. They really had thought of everything. They were using my demanding career against me, spinning my financial success as proof of parental neglect. They were portraying my frantic rescue of my freezing son as an erratic kidnapping. They were banking entirely on the stereotype of the cold, career-obsessed woman who tosses her family aside for a paycheck. I nodded slowly, absorbing the full scope of their fabrication. Investigator Thompson, they have certainly provided you with a very compelling story. It hits all the right emotional notes and positions them as the selfless saviors of a neglected child. There is only one problem with their narrative. And what is that? Thompson asked, raising an eyebrow. I clicked the metallic locks on my briefcase open. The sound was sharp and decisive in the quiet room. They are pathologically lying to you to cover up federal wire fraud and severe child abuse, I said, pulling out the thick, meticulously organized binder my team had prepared. I slid the binder across the table. Investigator Thompson, this is not a story. This is a documented paper trail. I suggest we start with the financial aspect, since my mother claims I refused to provide adequate support. Thompson opened the binder. The first tab was labeled Financial Support. I had included official bank wire transfer receipts for the past 6 months. As you can see, I explained, pointing to the highlighted sections, I transferred exactly $4,000 on the first of every single month into a revocable family trust. I provided my mother with an authorized credit card linked directly to that trust. The memo line on every single transfer clearly states, quote, for Leo's medical housing and dietary care, unquote. I provided them with $24,000 specifically for my son. Thompson's eyes widened slightly as she reviewed the official bank documents. This directly contradicts their statement about your lack of financial support, she noted. I turned the page to the next tab labeled Forensic Audit. That is because they did not use the money for my son, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register. This is a preliminary report from an independent forensic accountant. It traces every single dollar of that 24,000. I watched investigator Thompson's face as she read through the audit. I watched her professional detachment begin to crack as she processed the itemized list of stolen funds. She saw the $8,000 spent on Hermes handbags and luxury spa treatments for Brittany. She saw the thousands spent on my parents' country club dues and first-class tickets to the Amalfi Coast. Then I pointed to this most critical section. And here, Investigator Thompson, is where my brother-in-law Terrence committed a federal felony. I traced the path showing how Terrence routed the trust funds intended for Leo's care directly into a limited liability company registered under his name to pay off fraudulent business loans. Thompson looked up from the binder, her expression shifting from skepticism to deep concern. He diverted child support funds through a corporate entity to pay off personal business debt, she asked, confirming she understood the legal implications. Yes, I replied. It is textbook federal wire fraud. But the financial theft is not the reason my son is currently hooked up to an oxygen machine. I flipped to the final tab labeled Medical Evidence. I slid the preliminary report from Dr. Aris across the table. This is the official medical assessment from the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. My son did not catch a simple winter bug. He is suffering from severe bilateral pneumonia and mild malnutrition. The doctor explicitly notes that his condition is consistent with prolonged exposure to freezing damp environments and insufficient caloric intake. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. My parents did not move him to a storage closet to teach him discipline, Investigator Thompson. They gutted his bedroom, the room I paid for, to build a custom luxury playroom for Brittany's daughter. They threw my sick child onto a concrete floor and fed him canned goods while they dined on imported steak and wine bought with his money. When I found him last night, he had a fever of 102 degrees and was struggling to breathe. Investigator Thompson stared at the medical report. The color had drained from her face. The fabricated story my family had sold her in the lobby was rapidly disintegrating under the crushing weight of irrefutable evidence. They called you today because I froze their access to that trust account last night, I explained, delivering the final blow. Their luxury car deposits are bouncing, their business loans are defaulting. They did not call Child Protective Services to protect my son. They called you to extort me. They are trying to use the authority of the state to force me into paying them child support so they can continue funding their fraudulent lifestyle. Thompson closed the binder, her jaw set in a hard line. She looked at me with a completely different expression now. It was no longer the look of an investigator questioning a suspect. It was the look of a state official who realized she had just been lied to by a group of incredibly dangerous predators. Ms. Nicole Thompson said, her tone shifting from professional detachment to grim determination. I need to make some phone calls immediately. Please do, I replied, leaning back in my chair. And when you are finished, I believe you have some people waiting for you in the lobby who are going to be very surprised by the direction this investigation is about to take. Investigator Thompson did not hesitate. She stood up from the small consultation table. She pulled a secure state-issued smartphone from her blazer pocket and stepped toward the far corner of the windowless room. I remained seated in my chair, my hands folded neatly over the thick binder. I listened quietly as Thompson dialed her supervisor. She rattled off a series of code numbers and requested an immediate background check cross-reference on Terrence and my parents. She then contacted the hospital administration desk to officially verify the signature and badge number of Dr. Aris on the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit report I had provided. It took exactly 8 minutes for the state apparatus to confirm my documents were authentic. Thompson ended the call and walked back to the table. She sat down heavily, her eyes locked onto mine. I apologize for my initial skepticism, Nicole Thompson said. In my line of work, we are trained to look for defensive posturing. What you have handed me is not a defense. It is a meticulously documented prosecution. I need to go through these records line by line to build the emergency removal order for your parents and your brother-in-law. I nodded, opening the binder and turning back to the first tab. Let us start with their claim that I am an unfit absentee mother. I slid my employment contract across the table. I am a senior healthcare management consultant. This contract details my legal employment status, my travel obligations, and my compensation package. I earn a mid-six-figure base salary with performance bonuses. I did not abandon my son. I accepted a grueling, high-paying national contract specifically to secure his future college tuition and long-term medical care. My family was fully aware of my schedule. We signed a notarized temporary guardianship agreement, which is also in that folder, stipulating that they would provide a safe, nurturing environment in my childhood home while I traveled. Thompson reviewed the notarized guardianship agreement and the employment contract, running her finger along the crisp legal text. This proves you established a formal, legally binding care plan, she noted. It completely invalidates their claim of physical abandonment. They agreed to be his temporary guardians and accepted the responsibilities that came with that role. Exactly, I replied, my voice steady and cold. Which brings us to the financial abandonment claim. They told you I refused to send enough money to keep the heat on. Turn to the second tab. Thompson flipped the heavy pages. She stared at the bank wire receipts I had printed directly from my private wealth management portal. I pointed to the bolded transaction dates. On the first of every month without fail, an automated wire transfer of $4,000 was deposited into the revocable family trust account. Look at the memo line on the official bank ledger. It reads explicitly, "For Leo's medical housing and dietary care." I gave them $48,000 a year tax-free just to watch my son. They had absolute financial abundance to keep him safe, fed, and warm. Thompson traced the transaction numbers. And yet your son is currently suffering from severe malnutrition. I turned to the third tab, revealing the independent forensic audit prepared by Victor. Because Terrence and Brittany are thieves, I stated flatly. The audit traces the precise routing of those funds. Notice how the money moves from the trust account into a limited liability company registered under Terrence's name. He claimed he was a tech startup chief executive officer. He is actually a fraud drowning in high-interest debt. He used my son's care money to pay off his fraudulent business loans. Thompson scrutinized the itemized expenditure list, her jaw tightening as she read the luxury purchases. Hermes handbags, spa weekends, country club dues, a deposit for a Tesla Cayenne. She looked up, her eyes flashing with genuine disgust. They spent $24,000 on luxury goods in 6 months, and according to this forensic breakdown, they allocated exactly $50 a month for your son's food. They literally starved a 7-year-old boy to fund a fake lifestyle. That is correct, I said, fighting to keep my emotions detached. Now turn to the final tab, the medical report from Dr. Aris. This is where their financial crimes cross the line into severe physical abuse. Thompson read the stark clinical language detailing Leo's bilateral pneumonia and his dangerously compromised immune system. The report explicitly noted that the child had been subjected to freezing damp environmental conditions for an extended period. My parents did not downsize his living space to teach him discipline. I explained, the cold fury finally bleeding into my voice. They completely gutted the beautiful heated guest bedroom I had paid to furnish for him. They threw all his belongings away and built a lavish, custom-designed princess playroom for Brittany's daughter Zoe. They needed a place to put Leo, so they shoved him into an uninsulated, unheated storage closet at the back of the house. They threw a bare mattress on the concrete floor and locked him in there during the brutal Connecticut winter. They forced him to freeze so they could show off a designer playroom to their wealthy neighbors. When I found him last night, he was delirious with a 102-degree fever, eating rock-hard leftover rice from a paper plate. Investigator Thompson closed the binder. The sharp, decisive smack of the heavy cardboard covers echoed in the small consultation room. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and entirely damning. My family had walked into the hospital lobby, believing they could weaponize the state child protection system against a traveling mother. They had crafted a perfect, tear-jerking narrative of sacrifice and victimhood, but they had vastly underestimated my ability to document, track, and prosecute their every move. I watched Thompson process the reality. They were not the victims. They were about to become federal inmates. Investigator Thompson did not say another word to me. She simply picked up her tablet, gathered the thick binder of evidence I had provided, and stood up. The transformation in her demeanor was absolute. She had walked into this room preparing to interrogate a neglectful, absentee mother. She was walking out, preparing to dismantle a criminal enterprise disguised as a suburban family. I followed her out of the consultation room. We walked in tandem down the sterile hospital corridor toward the main elevators. The silence between us was charged with purpose. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor lobby together. As the doors slid open, the scene before us was almost exactly as I had left it. My mother Susan was still perched on the edge of a plush lobby chair, dabbing her eyes with a pristine tissue. My father David stood beside her, his hand resting comfortingly on her shoulder. Brittany was scrolling through her phone, no doubt checking the engagement on her defamatory social media posts. Terrence was pacing back and forth, projecting the image of a deeply concerned uncle and a highly stressed chief executive officer. They saw Investigator Thompson approach and immediately snapped to attention. The theatrical grief instantly intensified. Susan let out a soft, shuddering breath and stood up, reaching out a hand toward the investigator. "Oh, thank goodness you are back," Susan said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Have you spoken to her? Have you seen how unstable she is? Please tell me you are going to protect our grandson." Investigator Thompson stopped a few feet away from them. She did not reach out to take my mother's hand. She stood with her feet planted firmly apart, her posture projecting absolute state authority. I stood slightly behind her, watching my family's performance begin to falter in the face of her icy reception. Mrs. Susan Investigator Thompson began, her voice ringing with professional detachment. "I have indeed spoken with your daughter. I have also reviewed the extensive documentation she provided regarding the financial arrangements made for Leo's care over the past 6 months." My father David stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "Financial arrangements," he repeated, sounding momentarily confused. "What does money have to do with this? We are talking about a mother who abandoned her sick child." "It has everything to do with this," Mr. David Thompson replied sharply. "Especially when the documentation clearly proves that your daughter wired $24,000 directly to you and your wife, explicitly designated for Leo's medical and dietary needs." The color instantly drained from my mother's face. Her hand dropped to her side. Brittany stopped scrolling on her phone, her head snapping up to look at me. Terrence stopped pacing. "I have also reviewed the independent forensic audit detailing exactly how those funds were diverted." Thompson continued, her gaze sweeping across the four of them. "I am aware of the $8,000 spent on luxury goods. I am aware of the country club dues. And I am explicitly aware that the majority of those funds were routed through a limited liability company registered to Terrence to pay off personal business loans." Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The arrogant tech bro persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a panicked fraud caught in the headlights of a federal investigation. "But the most concerning document I reviewed," Thompson said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register, "is the preliminary medical report from the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. The attending physician has documented severe malnutrition and bilateral pneumonia directly caused by prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. Your daughter provided photographic evidence of the unheated storage closet where you forced your grandson to sleep while you converted his designated bedroom into a playroom." My mother staggered backward, collapsing into the lobby chair. She looked like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. David stammered, taking a step toward the investigator. "Now listen here, there has been a massive misunderstanding. You cannot possibly believe these fabricated documents over a respectable family. The documents are bank certified, and the medical report is verified," Thompson stated, cutting him off completely. "The investigation into Nicole for child abandonment is officially closed as unfounded. However, I am immediately opening an emergency investigation into both of you for severe child neglect and financial exploitation. Furthermore, I am legally obligated to forward the forensic audit regarding the diverted funds to the state prosecutor's office for review of potential wire fraud." The lobby descended into absolute stunned silence. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. They had called the state to extort me, and they had just handed the state the exact evidence needed to destroy them. Brittany was the first to break the silence. Her voice was shrill, panicky, and completely devoid of her usual entitlement. "Nicole, you cannot do this. You cannot send Mom and Dad to jail. You cannot ruin Terrence's career over a misunderstanding. Tell her you made it up. Tell her you faked the audit." I stepped out from behind Investigator Thompson. I looked at my sister, taking in her desperate, terrified expression. "I did not fake anything, Brittany," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I simply provided the receipts you all forgot I kept." My mother suddenly burst into genuine hysterical tears. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "Nicole, please." She sobbed, all her theatrical dignity gone. "Please, you have to stop this. We are your family. We made a mistake. We got greedy, but we did not mean to hurt Leo. Please do not let them take everything away from us. I will do anything. Just drop the counterclaim. Please, Nicole, I am begging you." I looked down at her, hands clutching my sleeve. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my jacket. "I am not dropping anything," I said, stepping back. "The state has the evidence. What happens next is entirely out of my hands." My father looked at me, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in him before. "What do you want from us, Nicole?" he pleaded, his voice shaking. "You have your son. You froze the accounts. What more do you want?" I looked at the four of them, broken, terrified, and finally facing the consequences of their actions. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. "We will discuss this at your 35th anniversary party this Saturday," I said, my voice echoing softly in the quiet lobby. "I know you borrowed heavily to host 50 elite guests and Terrence's potential investors. I would not dream of missing it. I have a very special gift for the family." I turned around and walked back toward the elevators, leaving them drowning in the absolute panic of their impending destruction. The dominoes were falling perfectly according to plan. The following Saturday arrived with crisp winter clarity. I spent the morning at my city apartment, ensuring Leo was comfortable and finalizing the last details of my plan. His recovery was remarkable. He was breathing easily and his energy had returned. The pediatrician cleared him for normal activity, provided he avoided exertion and extreme cold. He was safe, warm, and entirely unaware of the absolute destruction I was about to unleash on the people who had hurt him. My parents' 35th anniversary party was scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening. I knew from intercepting an email accidentally copied to an old family address that David and Susan had gone to extreme lengths to host this event. Desperate to maintain their social standing and keep up the facade of wealth for Terrence's potential investors, they had bypassed traditional banks since I froze the trust. Instead, they had taken out a massive high-interest loan from a predatory shadow creditor. They had literally mortgaged their non-existent future to pay for imported champagne, artisan hors d'oeuvres, and a live string quartet. They were hosting a 50-person gala in a house they did not own, using money they could not repay to impress people who did not care about them. It was a spectacular display of narcissistic delusion, and I was about to be the premier guest. I hired a private driver to take Leo and me to the Connecticut suburb. I wanted to arrive exactly 1 hour after the party began, ensuring every single guest was present, and the event was at its absolute peak. I wore a tailored crimson pantsuit that projected absolute authority. My hair was styled sleekly back, and my makeup was flawless. I did not look like a grieving victim. I looked like an executioner. Leo wore a sharp little navy blazer and held my hand tightly as we walked up the sweeping driveway of the estate. The house was blazing with light. Expensive floral arrangements flanked the double front doors. The faint sound of classical music drifted through the crisp night air. I did not knock. I simply turned the brass handle and pushed the doors open. The entryway was bustling with hired staff carrying silver trays. I bypassed them entirely, leading Leo directly into the massive sunken living room. The space was packed with the elite of their suburban social circle. Local politicians, country club board members, and the wealthy investors Terrence had been aggressively courting. My mother, Susan, was holding court near the fireplace, wearing a designer gown that likely cost more than a month's rent. My father, David, stood beside her, projecting the image of a successful patriarch. Brittany and Terence were working the room, laughing loudly and handing out business cards. My entrance was not subtle. The crimson suit caught the light, and my presence seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. The conversations nearest the doorway faltered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd, spreading outward from my position like a shockwave. Within 30 seconds, the string quartet was the only sound remaining in the massive room. Susan turned toward the silence, her practiced smile freezing on her face the moment she saw me. Her eyes darted to Leo, then back to me, her expression twisting from shock to absolute terror. David gripped his champagne flute so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter. Brittany dropped a cocktail napkin, her jaw falling open. Terence stopped mid-sentence while pitching an investor, his eyes widening as he realized his primary funding source had just walked through the front door. I did not break my stride. I walked slowly and deliberately to the absolute center of the living room, holding Leo's hand. The guests parted for me instinctively, sensing the dangerous energy radiating from my every step. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I am so sorry for the late arrival. It took a bit of time to ensure my son was healthy enough to travel after his recent hospitalization in the pediatric intensive care unit." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Several women placed their hands over their mouths, looking in horror at Leo's pale but recovering face. The word hospitalization hung in the air instantly, destroying the celebratory atmosphere. Susan lunged forward, her face flushed with panic. "Nicole, what are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "You are ruining our anniversary. You need to leave immediately." I looked at my mother, my expression a mask of impenetrable calm. "Ruining your anniversary, Susan?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the investors standing near Terence could hear every word. "I thought you would be thrilled to see us. After all, you and David fought so hard to convince Child Protective Services that you were the perfect guardians just 3 days ago." The mention of Child Protective Services hit the room like a physical blow. The wealthy guests exchanged alarmed glances, stepping further away from my parents. In their social circle, a visit from state investigators was the ultimate scandal. David rushed forward, attempting to grab my arm. He tried to force a jovial laugh for the crowd, but it sounded like a dying engine. "Now, Nicole, let us not air family misunderstandings in front of our guests. Come into the kitchen and we can sort this out privately." I stepped back out of his reach. "There is nothing left to sort out privately, David," I stated flatly. "I spent 5 years prioritizing your privacy and your pride. I spent 5 years funding this lavish lifestyle so you could pretend you were not utterly bankrupt. But when you decided to lock my son in a freezing storage unit and steal his medical funds to buy designer handbags, you forfeited your right to privacy." The silence in the room was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. Every single guest was staring at my family, their expressions morphing from confusion to outright disgust. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The trap was sprung and the audience was captivated. It was time to deliver the final killing blow. I stood in the center of the massive living room, holding my son Leo's hand. The entire party of 50 elite guests had ground to an absolute halt. The string quartet had fallen silent, and the only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. My parents, David and Susan, were frozen in place, their faces pale with shock and terror. My sister Brittany clutched her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might shatter in her hand. My brother-in-law Terence, who had been aggressively networking with potential investors just moments before, was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated panic. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I spoke. I wanted every single person in this room to hear exactly what I had to say. "I spent 5 years prioritizing your privacy and your pride," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. "I spent 5 years funding this lavish lifestyle so you could pretend you were not utterly bankrupt. But when you decided to lock my son in a freezing storage unit and steal his medical funds to buy designer handbags, you forfeited your right to privacy." The collective gasp from the guests was audible. The wealthy investors Terence had been courting exchanged alarmed glances. In their world, financial ruin was a faux pas, but child abuse was an absolute scandal. They began stepping away from my family, creating a physical barrier between themselves and the sudden toxicity radiating from David and Susan. My father David finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual authoritative boom. "Nicole, please," he stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are upset, and you are exaggerating. Let us go into the kitchen and talk about this like a family. We can explain everything." I did not move an inch. "There is nothing left to explain, David," I replied, my tone completely devoid of warmth. "And we are certainly not a family. A family does not commit federal wire fraud to fund a fake luxury startup while a 7-year-old boy battles severe bilateral pneumonia." Terrence stepped forward, his arrogant tech bro persona attempting a desperate comeback. "Now listen here, Nicole," he said, puffing out his chest. "You are making wild accusations because you are bitter about your own failures as a mother. You have no proof of any financial impropriety. My business is fully legitimate, and I will not allow you to slander me in front of my esteemed guests." He turned to the group of investors, forcing a confident smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unfortunate interruption. My sister-in-law has been under a tremendous amount of stress lately and is prone to these kinds of dramatic outbursts. Let me assure you that my company is perfectly positioned for this next round of funding, and our growth projections remain entirely solid." He raised his champagne glass, attempting to salvage the moment with a toast. "To the future," he declared, projecting absolute confidence. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "To the future," I echoed. "Let us take a look at that future, shall we?" I released Leo's hand and walked calmly toward the massive 85-inch smart television mounted above the fireplace. It had been displaying a slideshow of my parents over the years, a curated loop of fake happiness. I pulled my phone from my pocket, and within 3 seconds, I had mirrored my screen directly to the television, overriding their carefully constructed image. The screen flickered and then illuminated the room with a stark clinical document. It was not a family photo. It was a certified legal notice. Terrence's confident smile vanished instantly, his face drained of color as he recognized the document displayed in high definition for every single guest to see. "This," I announced, turning back to the room, "is the official bankruptcy filing for Terrence's so-called luxury startup. As you can clearly read, his company has zero viable assets and over $400,000 in defaulted high-interest loans. He is not a successful chief executive officer. He is a fraud drowning in debt." The investors who had been listening to Terrence's pitch just minutes ago stared at the screen in absolute horror. One of them, a sharp-looking woman in a tailored suit, pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, likely alerting her team to kill any pending deals. But I was not finished. I swiped my screen, and the television displayed the next document. It was a summary page from Victor's forensic audit, highlighted and annotated for maximum impact. "And this," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority, "is the independent forensic audit detailing exactly how Terrence attempted to keep his fraudulent company afloat over the last 6 months. He did not secure angel investors. He committed federal wire fraud." I pointed to the highlighted sections on the screen. "He routed $24,000 out of a revocable family trust account. That money was specifically legally designated for my son's medical care and housing. Terrence stole it to pay off his fraudulent business loans, while his wife Brittany used the remainder to buy vintage Hermes handbags and luxury spa treatments." Brittany let out a shrill, panicked cry. She dropped her champagne glass and the crystal shattered against the hardwood floor. "Nicole, stop it!" she screamed, her face contorted in absolute desperation. "You are ruining everything." I turned my cold gaze directly onto her. "You ruined everything, Brittany," I corrected her sharply. "You ruined it the moment you decided a custom-built princess playroom was more important than my son's health. You ruined it when you locked him in an unheated storage closet and fed him $50 worth of canned food while you spent his money on chemical peels." The room was completely paralyzed. The guests were trapped in a state of morbid fascination, unable to look away from the absolute destruction of a family they had believed to be their social equals. The wealthy investors were already edging toward the front door, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of federal wire fraud and child endangerment. My mother, Susan, finally broke. She collapsed onto the pristine white sofa, sobbing hysterically. Her carefully maintained image of the perfect suburban matriarch was completely annihilated. She looked up at me, her face streaked with expensive mascara. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered hatred. "You are no longer my daughter. I disown you. Get out of my house right now." I stood in the center of the room, the glow from the television casting a stark light over the wreckage of their lives. I had waited 5 long years for this exact moment. I had financed their delusion, protected their pride, and swallowed their insults. And now I was going to deliver the final lethal strike. I did not flinch at her screaming. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope Elias had prepared. I walked over to the coffee table and dropped it directly in front of her. The heavy thud of the envelope hitting the wood echoed in the silent room. "It has not been your house for 5 years, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and utterly merciless. Susan stared at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished mahogany coffee table. Her breathing was ragged and uneven. The guests surrounding us remained completely frozen, captivated by the unfolding spectacle. My mother shook her head in furious denial, refusing to touch the heavy paper package. "You are lying," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "David and I own this estate. You are just a spiteful, jealous woman trying to humiliate us in front of our esteemed friends. Get out of my house right now. You are no longer my daughter." I did not move an inch. My posture remained absolutely rigid, radiating an unbreakable authority. I reached forward and flipped the flap of the manila envelope open. I pulled out the crisp legal documents, spreading them across the table for anyone close enough to see. The primary document bore the undeniable seal of the State Real Estate Commission. "I am not lying, Susan," I replied, keeping my tone clinically detached. "5 years ago, you and David bankrupted yourselves trying to maintain your precious country club membership. You were 60 days away from total foreclosure. The bank was preparing to seize this property and physically remove you from the premises. You were terrified of the social humiliation. You were terrified that your wealthy neighbors would find out you were completely broke. So I stepped in and fixed your mess. I purchased your foreclosed debt directly from the bank." My father let out a strangled gasp. His eyes locked onto the property deed. "The holding company," he whispered, trembling. "The corporate landlord we have been paying our rent to." "That is correct," I stated. "I am your corporate landlord. I bought this estate to save you from living on the street. I subsidized your monthly rent to keep you geographically contained and out of my daily life. I let you host extravagant dinner parties here because I pitied you. I handed you the illusion of wealth on a silver platter. But you threw that grace back in my face." I tapped the second document resting on the table. It was printed on the heavy, intimidating letterhead of my ruthless family law attorney. "This corporate lease comes with rigid covenants regarding the premises. Section 7 explicitly prohibits any illegal or criminal activity on the property. Section 9 forbids room conversions without written authorization." Brittany let out a loud, panicked sob. She grabbed Terrence's arm, but he was staring blankly at the floor. "You violated Section 9, the absolute second. You gutted my son's bedroom." I continued, raising my voice so the investors could hear. "You violated Section 7 the moment you locked a 6-7-year-old boy in an unheated storage closet. You committed criminal child endangerment directly on my property. That is a material, uncurable breach of your lease agreement." I picked up the formal eviction notice and held it out. "This is an unconditional 48-hour eviction notice. You cannot pay a fine to fix this. You cannot negotiate a settlement. Your tenancy is officially and permanently terminated. You have exactly 2 days to pack up Zoe's custom-designed princess bed and her mountain of designer toys. You have 48 hours to gather your fake designer clothes and vacate my property before the county sheriff arrives to physically forcibly remove you from the estate. The absolute finality of my words struck the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy investors Terence had spent months courting did not wait for another invitation to leave. The sharp woman in the tailored suit who had been texting furiously earlier simply turned on her heel and walked out the front door without a single backward glance. The other financial backers immediately followed suit, abandoning their half-empty champagne flutes on side tables and mantelpieces. They fled the house eager to distance themselves from a man exposed as a federal fraud and a family exposed as child abusers. Terence watched his entire fake empire walk out the front door. He dropped his head into his hands, letting out a guttural sound of pure defeat. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably, as she realized her luxurious lifestyle was completely permanently over. She had traded her guaranteed comfort for a few extra designer handbags, and now she was about to be homeless. Susan sank onto the white sofa, covering her face with her trembling hands. The grand 35th anniversary party she had borrowed heavily from dangerous shadow creditors to host had transformed into her ultimate public execution. Every single guest she had invited to witness her faux prosperity had instead witnessed her absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. Her social standing, the only thing she truly valued in this world, was reduced to ashes. The neighborhood gossip would spread the story of her child abuse and eviction before the sun even rose. David stood completely frozen, staring at the eviction notice resting on his coffee table. The man who had confidently yelled at me in the hospital corridor, claiming I was nothing without this family, was now stripped of everything. He had no wealth, no power, no home, and no legacy. He was simply a broke, elderly man, facing potential federal charges. I looked down at my son Leo. He was watching the chaotic scene with wide, curious eyes, but he did not look frightened. He held my hand tightly, his small fingers warm and secure against my palm. He knew he was finally safe. He knew his mother had moved heaven and earth to protect him from the monsters hiding in plain sight. I picked up my briefcase and turned my back on the miserable ruins of my biological family. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not look back to see their tears. I simply walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp, freezing winter air, with my son by my side, leaving them to face the absolute devastation of their own choices. The drive back to my city penthouse was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in years. I watched the suburban landscape blur past the tinted windows of the private car, holding Leo's hand as he fell asleep against my shoulder. The heavy, toxic weight of familial obligation had been completely severed. I had finally excised the parasites from my life. Precisely 48 hours later, the legal machinery I had set in motion executed its final ruthless sequence. I did not attend the eviction in person. I did not need to. Elias arranged for a private security contractor to accompany the county sheriffs to the Connecticut estate, ensuring the removal process was strictly documented. According to the detailed security report, the scene was a masterclass in humiliated desperation and absolute chaos. David and Susan had spent the entire 2 days frantically calling every relative, friend, and country club acquaintance, begging for a loan to cover a deposit on a new rental. Every single person declined their calls. The neighborhood gossip mill had operated with terrifying efficiency. The elite investors who fled the anniversary party had talked loudly and frequently. The community knew all about the severe child abuse, the financial exploitation, and the fake corporate facade. My parents were absolute social pariahs. When the sheriffs knocked on the heavy oak doors at exactly 8 in the morning, my parents had barely packed a fraction of their extensive belongings. Brittany threw a massive theatrical tantrum on the front lawn, screaming at the armed deputies as they supervised the rapid removal of her designer clothing. The custom-built princess castle remained firmly bolted to the wall inside the bedroom. She could not afford the specialized moving crew required to dismantle it, and my security contractor absolutely refused to grant any extensions. All those expensive porcelain dolls and luxury toys she bought with my son's stolen medical funds were piled unceremoniously into cheap black trash bags and tossed onto the freezing concrete driveway. But the formal eviction was only the first wave of their ultimate destruction. As they stood on the curb, shivering next to their chaotic pile of luggage, a pair of black federal sport utility vehicles pulled up to the estate. Terrence's arrogant illusion evaporated. The second three federal agents stepped out, holding official execution warrants. The Financial Crimes Division had moved with blinding speed after receiving the comprehensive forensic audit and the hospital reports. They did not just want to question him, they were executing an immediate aggressive asset seizure. Terrence watched in absolute horror as the federal agents handed him the paperwork detailing the severe wire fraud charges. The agents impounded his expensive designer watch right off his wrist and seized his electronic devices for evidence. They informed him that his fraudulent startup, limited liability company bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government pending trial. The luxury car dealership, having caught wind of his bounced wire transfers, had already reported the electric vehicle as obtained under false financial pretenses. Terrence was left standing in the freezing cold, holding absolutely nothing but a looming federal indictment and the promise of a lengthy prison sentence. Brittany watched her husband being completely stripped of his ill-gotten assets and realized her luxurious free ride was permanently over. Her reaction was instantaneous and entirely self-serving. There was absolutely no genuine loyalty in her marriage. It was built purely on the shiny illusion of extreme wealth. The exact second she understood Terrence was facing serious federal prison time and mandatory financial restitution, she turned her back on him completely. She immediately contacted a cheap local attorney using borrowed funds and filed for an expedited divorce, citing profound financial fraud and extreme emotional distress. She threw Terrence directly to the federal wolves, hoping to salvage whatever tiny scraps of public sympathy she could possibly find. With no money, no credit, and their elite social network completely evaporated, David, Susan, and Brittany had nowhere else to go. They were forced to rent a dingy, cramped double room at a cheap roadside motel right off the noisy interstate highway. It was the kind of dilapidated establishment that charged by the week and smelled strongly of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The three adults, along with 5-year-old Zoe, were crammed into a depressing space significantly smaller than the master bathroom of their former sprawling estate. They had to rely on a local food pantry just to secure their next meal. Their spectacular public downfall became the premier topic of conversation across the entire Connecticut suburb. The dangerous shadow creditors they had borrowed money from for the lavish anniversary party began calling the motel room aggressively, demanding their immediate repayment, with exorbitant interest rates. Susan tried to attend a local community planning meeting a few days later, hoping to spin a false narrative of tragic victimization to anyone who would listen. The moment she walked into the community hall, women she had known for a decade physically turned their backs on her, refusing to make eye contact. The total social excommunication was brutal, absolute, and incredibly well-deserved. They were completely isolated from the world they once ruled. Terrence found himself entirely abandoned by the family he had relentlessly leeched off of for years. Unable to afford a private defense attorney, he was assigned a significantly overworked public defender, who advised him to take a restrictive plea deal. He moved into a transitional halfway house while awaiting his upcoming federal trial, effectively stripped of his expensive suits and unearned arrogance. David attempted to apply for an entry-level management position at a local retail store, but his age combined with the incredibly public nature of his recent financial scandal rendered him completely unemployable. The devastating reality of their new, impoverished existence slowly crushed their spirits. They spent their days trapped inside the suffocating motel room, blaming each other for their collective ruin. It was a fitting punishment for their endless, toxic greed. 4 weeks passed since the eviction and federal raids. While my former relatives languished in their cramped motel room, suffocating under their spectacular ruin, my life moved in the exact opposite direction. I used my massive contract bonus, to move Leo and myself into a breathtaking luxury high-rise penthouse in the heart of the city. It was an impenetrable fortress of glass and steel hovering 50 floors above the noisy streets. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was wrapping up a virtual meeting when the intercom on my desk chimed. The head concierge sounded uncharacteristically tense. "Ms. Nicole, I apologize for the interruption, but there is a woman in the lobby demanding to see you. She slipped past the outer gate. She claims to be your mother, and says it is an absolute family emergency. She is refusing to leave." A cold knot formed in my stomach, but it was quickly replaced by profound exhaustion. I knew this day would eventually come. Toxic people do not simply disappear when they hit rock bottom. They crawl back, searching for any remaining shred of empathy they can exploit. I could have instructed security to physically remove her, but hiding behind the concierge would leave a tiny window of hope open in her delusional mind. I needed to shatter that window completely. I needed to deliver the final, undeniable blow. "Send her up," I instructed the concierge, keeping my voice level. "But send 2 security guards up with her. They are to wait in the hallway. If she causes any issues, they will escort her off the premises immediately." I walked out of my office and stood in the grand marble foyer. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine hardwood floors. The elevator chime sounded with a soft ping. The heavy oak door swung open. Susan stepped into the hallway flanked by 2 towering security guards. I barely recognized the woman standing before me. The arrogant, polished suburban matriarch who had carelessly sipped expensive wine while my son froze was completely gone. In her place stood a fragile, aging woman. Her roots were showing gray and she wore a cheap synthetic winter coat. The luxurious aura she had maintained for decades had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, pathetic desperation. She looked past me, staring in absolute awe at the sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse. Her eyes tracked the custom artwork, the imported Italian furniture, and the panoramic views of the city skyline. I could see the painful calculation happening in her mind as she realized the sheer magnitude of the wealth she had permanently forfeited. "Nicole," she gasped, her voice cracking. She took a step forward, but I held up my hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. "You have exactly 2 minutes to state your business." "Susan," I said, my tone devoid of any emotion, "then security will escort you out." Her face crumpled into a mask of theatrical agony. She began to weep loudly, clutching her hands together against her chest. "Please, Nicole, you have to help us. The motel is awful. We have no money for food. David cannot find work, and the creditors are calling us day and night, threatening us. Brittany is staying at a women's shelter, and Terrence is facing 20 years in federal prison. We have lost absolutely everything." I stood motionless. "That is the natural consequence of committing federal wire fraud and felony child abuse," I replied. "You gambled your entire lives on a lie, and you lost. But we are your family," she cried, stepping closer, her voice reaching a desperate pitch. "I am your mother, Nicole. I carried you, I raised you, I loved you with all my heart. We made a terrible mistake. We let Terrence pressure us, and we got greedy, but we did not mean to hurt Leo. You have to find it in your heart to forgive us. Look at this place you live in. You have so much. You could write a single check right now and save our lives. You cannot just turn your back on your own flesh and blood. A mother's love is unconditional. Nicole, you know that." She was trying to use the very concept of maternal love as a weapon against me, to gaslight me into feeling guilty for her self-inflicted poverty. She wanted me to believe that because she gave birth to me, I owed her my financial protection, regardless of how ruthlessly she had endangered my own child. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of nothingness. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. There was just empty space where my mother used to be. "A mother's love is unconditional," I agreed, my voice dropping to a quiet, absolute certainty. "That is exactly why I ruined you. You threw my sick child onto a concrete floor to freeze. You starved him to buy yourself status. I am protecting my family. You are not it. I stepped back and gripped the heavy brass handle of my front door. You will never see me or my son again, I stated. Do not ever return to this building. I pushed the heavy oak door closed. The latch clicked into place, sealing her out of my life forever. I heard the muffled sound of her sobbing in the hallway, followed by the firm voices of the security guards escorting her back to the elevators. I turned around and walked back into the warm, beautiful sunlight of my home. I walked past the formal dining room and into the massive open-concept kitchen. Seated at the sprawling quartz island was Leo. He was wearing a bright red sweater, and his cheeks were flushed with healthy color. Leo was drawing at the kitchen island, safe and cherished. I wrapped my arms around his very small shoulders, holding him so very close. I had finally won. Not just my revenge, but absolute untouchable peace. The provided narratives, particularly Charlene's journey of overcoming her mother's relentless criticism, illuminate a profound truth about human resilience. Often we spend our lives seeking validation from those who are incapable of giving it mistakenly, tying our self-worth to their conditional approval. The core lesson learned is that true self-worth must be cultivated from within, entirely independent of a toxic family's flawed perceptions. In the story, Charlene endured years of public humiliation and constant comparisons to her sister. She was repeatedly made to feel like a disappointment for forging her own path and building a successful business instead of following her mother's prescribed script. However, the turning point occurs not when she finally receives an apology, but when she realizes she no longer needs one to feel complete. She discovers that walking away from the endless cycle of seeking approval is the ultimate victory. This teaches us that establishing boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an essential act of self-preservation. When a family dynamic relies on tearing one person down to maintain a false sense of control, staying in that environment only perpetuates the emotional damage. True freedom arrives the moment we stop trying to be enough for people who are committed to misunderstanding us. By creating a meaningful, authentic life surrounded by chosen, supportive individuals, we reclaim our power and heal our deepest wounds. We must learn to recognize when our efforts to earn love are actually destroying our inner peace. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and boldly step away from any table where your true worth is no longer being served.